The autumn morning had arrived with the kind of perfection that often precedes tragedy. Officer had been walking K9 partner Shadow through Riverside Park for nearly 8 years without a single significant incident. During that time, he'd witnessed countless seasons change. Hundreds of joggers pass by in their athletic gear, thousands of children play on the equipment, and an infinite number of ordinary moments that comprise the texture of community policing. But this morning felt different. Something in the air, perhaps it was the unusual stillness, or the way the golden leaves seemed to hang suspended rather than fall, suggested that the universe was holding its breath. Was 42 years old, with 20 years of service in the Riverside Police Department. His dark hair was beginning to silver at the temples, a fact he'd accepted with the kind of quiet resignation that comes with experience. He was divorced, no children of his own, but he had a deep commitment to his community that bordered on obsessive. His fellow officers called him the conscience of the department, a nickname he neither embraced nor rejected. When Shadow had been assigned to him as a K9 partner 7 years ago, had found something he didn't know he was searching for, a sense of purpose that extended beyond the typical confines of law enforcement. Shadow wasn't just a dog. Shadow was a living, breathing extension of desire to protect, to serve, and to make a tangible difference in people's lives. Shadow was a magnificent German shepherd, standing nearly 3 feet tall at the shoulder, with a coat that shimmered like burnished copper in the sunlight. The dog's lineage traced back to elite police and military bloodlines in Germany, a pedigree that manifested in every ripple of muscle, every alert movement of his ears, every intelligent glance of his dark amber eyes. Shadow had been trained extensively in search and rescue operations, trained to detect explosives with 98% accuracy, and trained to respond to over 100 distinct commands delivered in both English and German. In those 7 years Shadow had helped locate 3 missing persons, recovered evidence in a dozen investigations, and had become something of a local celebrity. Children in Riverside knew Shadow by name and reputation. The dog received fan mail at the police station, actual letters from admirers thanking him for his service. But Shadow was more than his training and credentials. The dog possessed an intuition that transcended his formal education. Had learned early in their partnership that Shadow seemed to sense danger before it manifested, could read subtle changes in human emotional states, and occasionally displayed behaviors that suggested he understood concepts that his training manual never explicitly covered. There had been times when Shadow refused to move in a particular direction, insisting on an alternative route, only for to later discover that the avoided path had contained a hidden hazard. Other times, the dog would fixate on a specific person in a crowd, and invariably, that person would turn out to be someone wanted for questioning in an ongoing investigation. These moments had convinced that some elements of Shadow's abilities rational explanation. The morning of October 15th began at 5:47 a.m., before sunrise, during's favorite time to patrol. He and Shadow had stopped at their usual coffee stand, a small kiosk run by a man named Tommy who always offered Shadow fresh water in a collapsible bowl and a double espresso, black, no sugar. Tommy had commented on the beautiful weather as he poured the coffee. "Gonna be a perfect day," Tommy had said, smiling. "Clear skies, mild temperature, that autumn breeze everyone loves." "You guys picked a good morning for a walk." Had nodded agreeably, but something in his intuition, that same quality he'd learned to trust in Shadow, whispered that perfection was often the calm before a storm. They had walked through the eastern entrance of Riverside Park at 6:15 a.m. The park was essentially empty at that hour, a handful of early morning joggers, one elderly woman walking a small terrier, and the groundskeeping crew beginning their daily maintenance. Shadow's energy levels were normal, his demeanor calm and focused. The dog walked with the kind of practiced obedience that came from years of training, his leash slack, his pace controlled. They had completed their route dozens of times before, east along the river path, north through the wooded section, west past the playground, and then a final circuit through the open meadow before heading back toward the station. It was approximately 7:45 a.m. when they turned onto the playground access path. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the grass and creating that particular golden light that photography enthusiasts called the golden hour, though in this case, it was closer to golden hour plus one. The playground itself was beginning to wake up. A few families were arriving, the smell of coffee drifting from thermoses in parents' hands, the sound of children's excited chatter beginning to break the morning silence. This was typically one of his favorite moments, that transition between the quiet morning and the busier day, a kind of liminal space where anything seemed possible. Shadow suddenly tensed, felt it first through the leash, a subtle stiffening, a slight tremor of heightened alertness. The dog's ears rotated forward with laser focus, and his nose lifted to catch some scent carried on the morning breeze. Had learned to trust these signals implicitly. "What is it, buddy?" he asked softly, giving the dog more leash to investigate. Shadow pulled gently but with clear purpose toward the far side of the playground, toward the wooden benches positioned in a quiet grove of oak trees. This area was largely hidden from the main path, a secluded spot where teenagers sometimes gathered in the evening, where people occasionally went to find a moment of solitude away from the active playground. As they approached the grove, eyes gradually registered what Shadow's senses had already detected. On one of the wooden benches, illuminated by a shaft of golden sunlight filtering through the leaves, sat a small child. The boy appeared to be approximately 3 years old, wearing a bright yellow jacket now visibly stained with dirt and what might have been dried food or worse. The child's hair was disheveled, matted with sweat or moisture of some kind. But what struck most profoundly was the child's absolute stillness, the way he sat, motionless, staring directly ahead with an expression of preternatural calm. The boy clutched a worn stuffed rabbit to his chest, the toy's fur matted and faded from years of love and handling. His mind immediately flooded with questions and scenarios. Where were the parents? How long had this child been out here? Was the boy injured? Had he been abandoned? Was he a runaway? Was he waiting for someone? The questions branched, each one opening into darker possibilities. In his 20 years of police work, had learned that children in dangerous situations rarely remained calm, most crying, most panicking, most showing clear signs of distress. This child's composure was deeply unsettling, almost supernaturally so. Shadow's reaction intensified. The dog began pulling more forcefully, straining toward the boy, but it wasn't an aggressive pull or even an urgent rescue pull. It was almost reverent, almost as if Shadow had encountered something sacred or significant. The dog's tail, normally held in a confident curve, now drooped slightly. His ears remained forward, but his entire body language suggested something between curiosity and profound respect. Then the child looked up. The boy's eyes, wide, blue, and possessed of a clarity that seemed impossible for someone so young, locked directly onto Shadow's gaze. It was a moment that would later be described by both and every witness he eventually told as if time itself had paused. In that exchange of looks between dog and child, something passed between them, some form of communication, some transfer of meaning, some acknowledgement of kinship. Felt the hair on his neck stand on end. His skin prickled with an atavistic recognition that he was witnessing something beyond his rational understanding. His heart began to pound in his chest with such force that he became aware of his own pulse in his temples, his throat, his wrists. This wasn't just another morning in the park. Had conducted hundreds of interviews with missing children over his 20-year career. He'd learned the protocols, the psychological approaches, the techniques for building rapport with traumatized young people. He knew the statistics, how many missing children were recovered within the first 24 hours, how the recovery rates dropped exponentially with each passing day, how the window of opportunity for safe recovery closed with devastating finality as time elapsed. But nothing in his training, nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for this particular moment. He approached the child slowly, deliberately, with the kind of measured movements he'd learned to employ when dealing with frightened animals or distressed individuals. Shadow remained at his side, but the dog's behavior was extraordinary. Normally, when approaching potentially traumatized persons, Shadow maintained a respectful distance, allowing to establish initial contact before the dog engaged. But this morning, Shadow walked beside with his entire body radiating an almost protective intensity. The dog's eyes never left the small boy on the bench, tracking every micro-movement, every breath. "Hey there, buddy," said softly, keeping his voice low and unthreatening, the way one might speak to an injured animal. "Are you okay? I'm Officer, this is Shadow, we're here to help." He crouched down slowly, reducing his physical height to be less intimidating to the small child. From this position, eye level with the boy, could observe details that had been invisible from a distance. The child's yellow jacket was indeed stained, with what appeared to be dried dirt and possibly vomit. His small hands, which clutched the stuffed rabbit with a grip that suggested hours of anxious holding, were dirty beneath short, bitten fingernails. Most striking of all were his eyes. The boy's blue eyes possessed a clarity that seemed almost anachronistic for someone so young, a lucidity that suggested either unusual maturity or a level of shock that transcended normal childhood responses. "My name is David," the boy said, his voice clear and articulate. The quality of his speech immediately flagged something in his mind. 3-year-olds typically employed syntax, shorter sentences, and struggled with complex vocabulary. This child's pronunciation was crisp, his grammar technically correct, his word choice sophisticated. "My mommy is sleeping. She fell down the stairs. She's hurt." The matter of with which David delivered this information suggested he'd rehearsed it, practiced it, repeated it in his mind so many times that it had become almost clinical in its delivery. Felt his stomach tighten. Potential injury, potential emergency situation, potential fatality. His mind immediately began the rapid calculus of worst-case scenarios. A child found alone suggested a caregiver in crisis. An injured caregiver suggested a limited window of opportunity for intervention. But something about David's demeanor contradicted the urgency of his words. The boy wasn't crying. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't displaying the behavioral indicators of acute trauma or terror that would be expected from a child whose mother had recently suffered a serious injury. "David, buddy, that's very important information," said, maintaining his calm demeanor while internally accelerating his mental processes. "Can you tell me where your mommy is? Do you know your address? Do you know what street you live on?" Shadow pressed against his leg, an unusual gesture of support or perhaps solidarity. The dog's breath came in soft, measured patterns, his entire frame rigid with attention. David looked down at his stuffed rabbit, turning the toy slightly in his small hands. "Big red house," he said quietly. "By the water, I don't know the name, but it's red, really red, and there's a river. I could see it from my bedroom window. The sun comes up there." The child paused, seeming to gather his thoughts with a deliberateness that struck as profoundly unusual. "The stairs go down. Mommy said never go down the stairs, but she went down to get the boxes with the lights. The boxes that hang on the tree, she said they were in the basement." David's voice began to tremble slightly. "She went down and then there was a loud sound, like when Mommy dropped the big pot, a crashing sound, and then, nothing, she stopped talking, she stopped moving." His trained mind was already running through the implications. Head trauma, possible loss of consciousness, possible internal bleeding, timeline critical for survival, but he forced himself to remain focused on the child. "David, how long ago did your mommy fall? Can you tell me?" Understood that young children possessed a fundamentally different relationship with time than adults. Minutes could seem like hours. Hours could compress into subjective eternity. "The sun came up 3 times, David said, pointing toward the eastern sky where the sun now hung in the morning air. "And the shadows moved. Then the house was dark, and the shadows moved again, and now the sun is coming up again. That's 3 times. The child's mathematics suggested a timeline of approximately 18 hours, possibly longer, possibly shorter, but somewhere in that devastating range where minutes mattered, where every second represented the risk of escalating brain damage, shock, or irreversible injury. His mind raced through the horrible arithmetic. If Jennifer, and he somehow already knew her name would be Jennifer, though David had never stated it, had been unconscious for 18 hours, the window for recovery was closing rapidly. Brain damage accelerates after extended periods of unconsciousness. Internal bleeding becomes increasingly catastrophic. Shock can become irreversible. The margin between life and death, between full recovery and permanent disability, narrowed with each passing minute. But what struck most profoundly was David's composure in the face of this information. The boy wasn't hysterical. He wasn't demanding rescue or expressing terror. He was stating facts with a kind of resigned acceptance that seemed impossible for someone so young. "David," asked carefully, "were you scared? Were you alone in the house all by yourself?" The boy nodded slowly. "I was scared at first, but then I wasn't. I put on my shoes, I found the door, I walked and walked. The sun was going away." David paused, and for the first time his expression shifted. Something passed across his young face, an emotion or recognition that seemed to crack his composure slightly. "I got tired. I was walking and walking and my feet hurt, so I sat on the bench, and I waited. I knew someone would come. Someone would find me, I knew because." David trailed off, his eyes drifting toward Shadow. "Because I could feel it. Like when Mommy is coming home and I know it before I hear the car. I just knew." Exchanged a glance with Shadow, then back to David. "You did really good, David. You were very brave. I'm going to help your mommy, but I need to call some people first, okay?" His hands were already moving toward his radio, but something made him hesitate. The psychological profile he was developing didn't fit standard models. Most abandoned or unsupervised 3-year-olds displayed profound distress. Most would be inconsolable, traumatized, displaying clear signs of shock or abuse. David displayed something else entirely, a kind of eerie equilibrium, as if he possessed foreknowledge of events, as if he'd been waiting with the certainty of someone who knew rescue was inevitable. Keyed his radio with hands that trembled slightly. "This is Unit 7. We have a situation requiring immediate assistance. Missing child located. Possible injured adult at residence. Stand by for additional information." The dispatcher acknowledged his call. As began to describe David's location and circumstances, the child reached down and placed his small hand on Shadow's head. The dog's entire body seemed to respond, vibrating with some frequency of emotion or recognition that couldn't quite interpret. "It's okay, David," the child whispered to the dog. "You helped me, thank you. My mommy will be okay now. You're a good boy. You're the best boy." Shadow's eyes glistened in the morning light and felt a chill cascade down his spine. This 3-year-old child was speaking to a police dog as if they shared some language, some understanding that transcended the normal boundaries of human-animal communication. The morning that had begun with such perfect beauty was rapidly transforming into something far more complex and deeply unsettling. The moment unfolded like a scene from a film that the laws of physics and reason had been in the process of radioing additional information to dispatch when David suddenly rose from the bench with deliberate purpose. The boy's movements were no longer those of a tired, traumatized 3-year-old. Instead, David moved with an almost ritualistic precision, his small body straightening, his chin lifting, his eyes clearing with an intensity that seemed to possess an almost ancient quality. Felt his radio transmission die on his lips as he observed the transformation occurring before him. David walked directly toward Shadow with the confidence of someone approaching an old friend rather than a strange dog. The child's small hand extended, and he placed his palm against Shadow's snout with a gentleness that should have been taught through careful, supervised introduction. But this was no careful introduction. This was a greeting between two beings who somehow already knew each other on a level that transcended normal canine-human interaction. "Shadow," David said clearly, his voice suddenly different, older somehow, carrying a weight and certainty that seemed impossible for a 3-year-old's vocal cords to produce. The name hung in the morning air like a proclamation, a recognition, a call to action. "We need to find my mommy. She's scared. She's at the big red house by the water." David paused, his small hand continuing to stroke Shadow's snout with practiced familiarity. "She needs us. She needs you. Will you help me find her?" Felt the world momentarily contract around him. His police training, his 20 years of experience, his rational mind, all of it collectively screamed at him that what he was witnessing was impossible. How could this child know the dog's name? Shadow's official designation within the police department was K9 Unit 7 Alpha 2. His nickname, Shadow, was used informally among the officers and staff, but it wasn't public knowledge. The dog's name had never been announced at community events. It wasn't on the dog's collar in large letters. Only his department identification number appeared there. There was no conceivable way this child, who had been lost and alone for 18 hours, separated from human civilization in a residential area far removed from the police station, could possibly know this dog's name. Shadow's reaction was equally impossible. The German Shepherd's entire body language shifted instantaneously. The dog, who had been trained to respond only to specific commands and voice, began to tremble. Not the tremor of fear, but something else entirely, something that resembled recognition, or perhaps the physical manifestation of emotional intensity being processed through a canine nervous system. Shadow let out a low whine, a sound had never heard the dog produce in 7 years of partnership. It was a sound of profound emotion, neither distress nor aggression, but something altogether different. The whine carried within it what could only describe as longing, as if Shadow were acknowledging something he'd been waiting to hear. Shadow pressed his nose against David's small hand with a gentleness that should have been impossible for a 70-pound German Shepherd to execute with such precision. The dog's eyes, typically alert and focused, glistened with what appeared to be moisture. Watched, unable to process what he was observing as his K9 partner, his rational, professionally trained partner, appeared to be weeping. Then Shadow turned. The dog's head rotated with deliberate slowness, his body following in a smooth, controlled motion. Shadow's gaze locked onto the direction of the residential neighborhood beyond the park, the direction where David had vaguely pointed earlier, the direction where a red brick house awaited discovery. The dog held this position, his entire body aligned toward that distant, unknown destination, his posture radiating purpose and determination. "Did that just happen?" Officer Sarah Williams's voice came from behind, shocking him into awareness that he was no longer alone with David and Shadow. Williams had arrived as backup at some point during the last few minutes, realized his mind had been so completely absorbed by the impossible moment unfolding before him that he'd failed to register her arrival. Williams stood approximately 15 feet away, her hand on her duty belt, her face mirroring the confusion and astonishment that felt radiating through his own body. Opened his mouth to speak, closed it, opened it again. Words seemed inadequate, insufficient, incapable of articulating what his eyes had just witnessed. I don't know," he finally managed. "Sarah, did you see that?" Williams nodded slowly, her professional demeanor struggling against the overwhelming absurdity of the situation. "The kid spoke to the dog, by name. How did he know the dog's name and the dog? I've never seen Shadow react like that. That's not normal K9 behavior." She paused, glancing at her notebook as if searching for rational protocols to guide this irrational situation. "We need to document this. We need to." But David interrupted, his small voice carrying a clarity that seemed almost impatient with adult processing speeds. "Shadow knows where my mommy is," the child said with absolute certainty. "Shadow is very smart. He can find her. He knows she needs help. He knows the way." David looked directly at and in the child's blue eyes saw something that froze every skeptical synapse in his brain. The boy possessed knowledge, not luck, not coincidence, not educated guessing. This child knew something with the certainty of direct experience. Sarah moved closer, her training attempting to reassert dominance over the surreal circumstances. "Okay, David, let's think about this logically. You've never seen this police dog before, correct? You couldn't possibly know his name from anywhere except. She trailed off, unable to complete the sentence because there was no logical completion. There was no except. There was no rational source for this knowledge. He told me, David said simply, returning his attention to Shadow. He placed both small hands on the dog's face, framing Shadow's snout between his palms. Shadow told me. He came to me when I was sitting on the bench. He showed me pictures. He showed me the park. He showed me his friend. He told me everything would be okay because Shadow help people. That's what they do. They find people who need help. David leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Shadow's, a gesture of profound intimacy. He told me to wait. He said the sun would come up one more time and then they would come. And they did. You came. Felt the hair on his arm stand on end. His skin prickled with an atavistic sensation that transcended rational fear. This wasn't just a child speaking about a dog as if they'd communicated. This was a child describing a scenario with such specific detail, such confident certainty, that it demanded either dismissal as childhood fantasy or acceptance of something that violated every law of physics and biology that understood. Shadow can take us to Mommy now, David continued, stepping back from the dog and reaching up to place his small hand on Shadow's neck. Can't you, Shadow? You're so brave. You're the best helper. My mommy will be okay because you're here. You're so smart. You always know what to do. The child's voice carried maternal tones, as if he were speaking not to a dog but to an equal, a partner, a friend who deserved recognition for extraordinary service. Shadow's body tensed, his muscles rippling beneath his copper-colored coat. The dog's eyes locked onto that distant neighborhood once more and could see the physical manifestation of absolute determination. Shadow was ready. Shadow knew. Shadow was communicating with a clarity that transcended barks or tail wags. He was broadcasting pure intention, pure purpose, pure certainty. And Sarah locked eyes across the space between them. In that exchange of glances, they shared a moment of profound uncertainty, a mutual acknowledgement that they were about to follow a path that logical explanation. Neither officer spoke. Neither officer questioned what they were witnessing, because somewhere beneath the layers of training and skepticism and rational thought, both of them understood that they were in the presence of something they couldn't explain, but something they could no longer deny. Okay, said quietly, his voice emerging steadier than he expected. We follow Shadow. If this leads nowhere, we've still got the kid safe and we're still searching for his mother. But if Shadow knows something. He didn't complete the thought. He didn't need to. They were both thinking the same impossible thing. The hunt was about to begin. Officer made a decision in that moment that would define the remainder of his career in law enforcement. He chose to abandon the rational protocols that had guided his 20 years of service. He chose to trust the impossible. He chose to follow a 3-year-old child and a German shepherd down a path that every logical framework he'd constructed around police work. Later, when asked by internal affairs investigators and curious journalists why he'd made such an unconventional decision, would struggle to articulate the reasoning. How could he explain that something deeper than logic, something more fundamental than training, had compelled him forward? How could he describe the moment when the rational mind surrenders to the overwhelming evidence of extraordinary circumstance? We're following that dog, said decisively, his hands already moving to adjust David's position on his shoulders. The child was clearly exhausted, his small legs unsteady from hours of walking and waiting. If Shadow leads us nowhere, we've still got the kid safe and we're still searching for the mother anyway. But if he leads us somewhere, trailed off, unable to complete the thought without sounding completely insane. Officer Williams simply nodded, accepting the logic of the situation, even if she couldn't quite accept the extraordinary premise underlying it. David toddled along between the two officers, one small hand periodically reaching up to place itself on Shadow's back. The contact seemed to energize both child and dog. Shadow's behavior had a complete metamorphosis. The dog no longer walked its side in the disciplined formation of professional training. Instead, Shadow moved with singular purpose, his nose constantly working the air, his body leaning forward with the intensity of a missile locked onto a target. The German shepherd pulled with gentle but insistent pressure on his leash, guiding rather than being guided, leading rather than following. They exited the park through the northern gate at approximately 8:15 a.m. The morning traffic was beginning to build. A few joggers passed them, nodding in greeting to and Sarah, completely unaware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. One elderly man with a small poodle stopped briefly, commenting on Shadow's apparent intensity. "Your dog looks like he's on an important mission," the man observed with a smile. Had managed only a tight grimace in response, unsure whether the stranger's observation was casual commentary or something more. Shadow pulled them onto Avenue, the main residential thoroughfare that connected the park to the surrounding neighborhoods. The street was lined with modest homes set back from the road, mature trees creating a canopy of autumn foliage. Shadow's pace quickened as they progressed, his body language becoming increasingly focused. David occasionally pointed with his small hand, offering gentle guidance. "That way, Shadow. You're so smart. You know where to go." The child spoke to the dog with the tone of someone encouraging a colleague through difficult work, not someone addressing a pet. Within 3 blocks, noticed they were being recorded. A woman standing on her front porch had raised her phone, capturing video of the unusual procession. 2 armed police officers, a large German shepherd moving with unmistakable purpose, and a tiny toddler in a yellow jacket. Knew immediately that this was no longer a contained incident. In the age of social media, nothing remained private, nothing remained isolated. By the time they reached their destination, assuming they reached a destination, this story would already be spreading through Riverside's digital networks. The sidewalk beneath their feet was lined with fallen leaves that crunched beneath their boots. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from a distant fireplace and the earthy smell of decomposing vegetation. David began to hum softly, a wordless melody that seemed to calm him. Shadow's ears rotated forward and backward, processing sounds beyond human hearing capability, tracking scents carried on the morning breeze. "Shadow is listening," David said with quiet certainty. "He can hear Mommy. She's far away, but Shadow can hear her. She's scared, but she's still sleeping. Shadow says we have to hurry. Hurry helps people." The child's words, spoken with such conviction and authority, struck with the force of genuine knowledge. How could a 3-year-old possess such specific information about his unconscious mother's emotional state? How could he possibly know that time was critical? By 8:47 a.m., they had traveled nearly a mile from the park. They were now moving through a section of Riverside that knew less intimately, a residential area that had been developed in the 1980s, filled with modest ranch-style homes and small yards. Shadow continued without hesitation, turning onto Riverside Drive, a street that, true to its name, ran adjacent to the actual Riverside waterway. His heart began to accelerate. They were moving in the direction that David had originally indicated. They were moving toward the river. Officer Williams spoke quietly into her radio, requesting additional units to stand by for possible emergency medical response. Dispatch acknowledged the request and could almost hear the confusion in the dispatcher's voice. They didn't have a specific address yet. They didn't have a confirmed incident yet. They only had the inexplicable trajectory of a police dog and the testimony of a traumatized child who somehow possessed impossible knowledge. The homes along Riverside Drive grew progressively larger. These were properties with more extensive grounds, homes positioned to take advantage of the river views. Shadow's movements became even more focused, if such a thing was possible. The dog pulled them around a curve in the road and suddenly saw it. The red brick house stood on a gentle hill approximately 50 yards from the river's edge. It was precisely as David had described, a substantial 2-story colonial with crisp red brick, white trim, and a well-maintained yard. A black sedan sat in the driveway. The mailbox at the end of the driveway bore the address, 1847 Riverside Drive. Shadow stopped directly at the threshold of the front lawn, his entire body vibrating with barely contained energy. The dog began barking, sharp, urgent barks that echoed through the quiet residential street. Not aggressive barks, but urgent ones, communicative ones, demanding ones. Shadow says Mommy is in the down place, David said, pointing toward the front door. The under place, where the stairs go. She's hurt. She can't wake up, but she's still breathing. Shadow says we have to help her now. And Sarah exchanged one brief glance of mutual understanding. They were about to take the final step down a path that would validate everything they just experienced or completely undermine it. There was no middle ground. There was only the possibility that they would find nothing, or the certainty that they would find everything. Shadow's barking intensified. A few neighbors had stepped out of their homes, curious about the commotion. A woman across the street raised her phone, didn't care. All that mattered was the front door of the red brick house. "Stay with us," David instructed, his hand already moving to his belt. "Officer Williams and I are going to check the house. We need to make sure your mommy is safe." They approached the front door carefully, professionally, their hands moving to their weapons as precaution against unknown circumstances. Reached for the doorknob, his fingers wrapping around the cold brass. The door was partially ajar, not locked, not sealed, just slightly open, as if waiting for them. Shadow pushed past them the moment the door opened wider, the dog racing into the interior of the house with single-minded purpose. And from somewhere deep within that red brick house, from somewhere in the darkness below the main level, came the faintest sound. Breathing. Labored, shallow breathing. The sound of someone clinging to life. Shadow moved through the front entrance of the red brick house like a guided missile seeking its target. The dog didn't hesitate, didn't pause to investigate rooms or follow normal search patterns. Instead, the German Shepherd raced directly toward the interior, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors with urgency that reverberated through the quiet home. And Officer Williams rushed after the dog, their hands on their duty weapons despite their certainty that they were entering a medical emergency rather than a criminal situation. The interior of the house reflected suburban normalcy disrupted by crisis. A living room with modest furniture, a television displaying a news channel on low volume, a kitchen visible through an open doorway with dishes piled in the sink. Everything suggested a family interrupted mid-routine, their ordinary life suddenly fractured by accident and circumstance. David clung to his neck as they moved deeper into the house, the child's small arms wrapped with surprising strength around the officer's shoulders. Shadow led them directly to a basement door, a wooden panel painted the same white as the surrounding wall trim, located near the kitchen. The dog began scratching at the door with urgency, his whines escalating in pitch and intensity. Immediately understood. Shadow wasn't searching anymore. Shadow knew exactly what lay beyond this threshold. Officer Williams moved to open the door while maintained his grip on his weapon with one hand and kept David secure with the other. The basement stairs descended into shadow, actual shadow, the kind that existed before comprehension, before light penetrated darkness. Williams switched on a wall-mounted light, and the wooden stairs became visible, disappearing into the depths below. The smell hit them first. The unmistakable odor of blood, mixed with bodily functions, the particular scent of medical crisis that any experienced officer could recognize. Shadow bolted down the stairs with Williams close behind, her training overriding any hesitation about descending into the unknown darkness. Carefully followed, his boots finding purchase on each wooden step, his mind calculating the risks and possibilities that awaited below. The basement was finished but poorly lit, with exposed pipes running across the ceiling and concrete floors. Cardboard boxes were stacked along one wall, the holiday decorations David had mentioned, still sealed and waiting for the season they would never decorate this year. And at the bottom of the basement stairs, precisely where David had indicated, lay Jennifer. She was a woman of approximately 35 years old, though her current condition made age difficult to assess with certainty. Her hair was matted with blood that had dried to a dark brown color. Her left leg was bent at an angle that suggested fracture, and her right arm lay at her side in an unnatural position that indicated possible dislocation. Most critically, she was completely unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, her skin pale with an ashen undertone that suggested advanced shock. Shadow pressed against Jennifer's motionless form, the dog's head dropping to rest on her chest. The German shepherd's body trembled with emotional intensity, his eyes glistening with what appeared to be genuine distress. The dog maintained contact with Jennifer's inert body, as if his presence alone could somehow sustain her through the crisis of her unconsciousness. "My God," Officer Williams breathed, immediately keying her radio. "We have a 1054, female, approximately 35 years old, unconscious with severe head trauma and multiple fractures. Request paramedics immediately to 1847 Riverside Drive." Her voice remained professional despite the horror of the situation unfolding before them. Dispatch responded within seconds. "Paramedics en route. ETA 4 minutes. Advise condition and any signs of consciousness." "No responsiveness. Shallow breathing. Significant bleeding. Possible internal injuries," Williams reported, her officers' training guiding her through the procedural responses despite the extraordinary nature of their arrival at this scene. Carefully descended the final stairs, still holding David, his mind processing the medical implications with grim clarity. Jennifer had been lying at the bottom of these stairs for approximately 18 hours. 18 hours of unconsciousness. 18 hours of no medical intervention, no emergency response, no access to the sophisticated equipment that hospitals employed to prevent further deterioration. 18 hours represented a critical threshold in head trauma cases, a boundary between recovery and permanent disability, between survival and catastrophic death. "David," said quietly to the child still clinging to his neck, "your mommy is going to be okay. The helpers are coming. Shadow found her just in time." The child nodded silently, his small face buried in shoulder. The boy's silence was perhaps more profound than tears would have been. David had been right. He had known. Some inexplicable knowledge had guided him to that park bench, had prompted him to speak to Shadow, had communicated with absolute certainty that help would arrive exactly when it was needed. The sound of sirens became audible outside the house within minutes, not the 4 minutes promised by dispatch, but closer to 2.5. Paramedics poured into the basement with practiced efficiency, their equipment and training immediately taking precedence over the impossible circumstances that had led to their discovery of Jennifer. They conducted rapid assessments, established IV lines, applied oxygen, began the careful process of stabilizing a critically injured patient for transport. "Head trauma consistent with a fall," one paramedic observed, his gloved hands carefully examining Jennifer's injuries. "Approximately 18 hours unconscious based on wound status. We need to get her to Riverside General immediately. Team standing by." Step back, allowing the medical professionals access to their patient. He positioned himself at the periphery of the basement, still holding David, still processing the extraordinary nature of what had transpired. Shadow remained in contact with Jennifer, refusing to be separated from the woman they had come to rescue. The dog pressed against her leg, maintaining physical connection even as the paramedics worked around him. "Come on, Shadow," said gently, understanding that the dog had done his part, that the work ahead belonged to medical professionals rather than rescue animals. "You did good, buddy. You found her. Now the helpers take over." Shadow reluctantly moved away from Jennifer, but the dog remained within sight of the paramedics' work, his intense amber eyes tracking every movement, every intervention, every moment of Jennifer's continued existence. The dog's entire body radiated a protective vigilance that seemed to transcend normal animal behavior. The paramedics carefully placed Jennifer on a stretcher, securing her with straps and preparing her for the journey up the basement stairs. One paramedic expressed concern about moving her with such unstable injuries, but protocol dictated rapid transport to a facility capable of providing the sophisticated intervention her condition required. They began the careful ascent, coordinating their movements to prevent further trauma to their patient's precarious medical state. "Is she going to be okay?" Officer Williams asked the senior paramedic, her professional composure wavering momentarily. The paramedic's expression was grave. "She's alive. That's the good news. The bad news is she's been unconscious for an extended period. Brain damage accelerates after about 6 hours without medical intervention. We're looking at a situation where she might survive, but the quality of survival remains uncertain. Every minute matters now. Let's move." The paramedics accelerated up the basement stairs, their equipment and patient following in urgent procession. Sirens wailed once more as the ambulance pulled away from 1847 Riverside Drive, racing toward Riverside General Hospital with lights flashing and emergency protocols fully activated. Stood on the front lawn of the red brick house, David still in his arms, Shadow at his side. The neighbors who had witnessed the emergency response clustered in small groups, their phones still recording, their minds attempting to process what they had observed. A woman attempted to ask questions about what had happened, but he simply shook his head and began walking back toward the police vehicles. Officer Williams approached, her notebook in hand, the weight of paperwork and investigation already pressing against her consciousness. "We need to document everything," she said, but her voice carried uncertainty. How would she document the impossible? How would she write an official report that included a 3-year-old communicating with a police dog? How would she explain the inexplicable in the language of law enforcement bureaucracy? David looked back toward the red brick house, his small hand reaching out toward Shadow. "Thank you," the child whispered to the dog. "Thank you for helping my mommy. You're the bravest helper ever." Shadow responded with a low whine, pressing his body against both child and officer. And in that moment, as the three of them stood together in the autumn morning light, each understood something fundamental about connection, about purpose, about the existence of mysteries that transcended rational comprehension. The ambulance carrying Jennifer raced through the streets of Riverside with emergency protocols fully activated. Inside the vehicle, paramedics worked with the coordinated precision of professionals who understood that every second represented the difference between recovery and permanent disability, between survival and death. 2 paramedics maintained constant monitoring of Jennifer's vital signs, checking her blood pressure, oxygen saturation, and neurological responses every 60 seconds. The driver navigated traffic with practiced urgency, knowing that the hospital was their destination, but that the real battle would only begin once they arrived. Riverside General Hospital's emergency department received the incoming paramedic notification at 9:23 a.m. A trauma alert was immediately activated. Surgeons were called in from their morning schedules. CT scan technicians stood ready. The neurosurgery team assembled with the kind of focused intensity that characterized critical medical situations. They had a window, perhaps only a few hours, to assess the damage, stop any internal bleeding, and prevent further deterioration of brain tissue. Jennifer's first CT scan revealed what the paramedics had suspected: a severe subdural hematoma, a significant pool of blood between her brain and skull that was exerting dangerous pressure on her neural tissue. She also had a depressed skull fracture on the left temporal region, indicating a high-impact collision with the corner of a stair. Her left leg was fractured in 2 places, and her right shoulder had been dislocated. Any one of these injuries would have been serious. The combination represented a life-threatening medical emergency. Dr. Robert, the chief of neurosurgery at Riverside General, examined Jennifer's scan images with practiced assessment. "We need to get her to OR immediately," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of critical decision-making. "The hematoma is expanding. If we wait even another hour, we risk irreversible brain damage or death. Start blood work, get the surgical team ready. We go in within 30 minutes." Jennifer was rushed to the operating room at 9:47 a.m., unconscious and unaware of the battle that would be waged over the next 4 hours to preserve her life and cognitive function. The surgical team worked with microscopic precision, carefully evacuating the accumulated blood, controlling bleeding vessels, preventing further trauma to vulnerable brain tissue. It was the kind of delicate, critical work that defined the highest expressions of medical science. Meanwhile, at the Riverside Police Department, David was placed in the care of Park, a social worker trained specifically in trauma-informed care for young children. Had worked with traumatized children for over 15 years, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for David. The child displayed an unusual equanimity, a kind of emotional steadiness that seemed almost impossible given his circumstances. Drove David to the Department of Child Services facility, a warm, welcoming space designed to help children feel safe during periods of family crisis. David sat quietly in the backseat of his vehicle, occasionally looking out the window but mostly remaining internal, processing events that his 3-year-old mind was somehow capable of comprehending with remarkable clarity. "David, honey," said gently as they drove, "I need to ask you some questions. Is that okay?" She kept her voice warm and non-threatening, understanding that children in shock sometimes shut down completely when approached with aggressive questioning. "Okay," David replied simply. "Your mommy had an accident, didn't she? She fell down the stairs." David nodded. "She was getting the boxes, the pretty boxes with the lights, the ones that go on the tree. She went down. I heard the big sound. I called for her, but she didn't answer. She didn't wake up." "That must have been very scary," observed, her years of training guiding her toward emotional validation rather than interrogation. "I was scared at first," David agreed. "But then I wasn't scared anymore, because I knew Shadow would help. Shadow said everything would be okay. Shadow said my mommy would be helped. Shadow said we had to go find the policeman." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was the part of David's account that didn't make logical sense. A 3-year-old child communicating with a police dog, receiving information from an animal, being guided by non-human intelligence toward rescue, had read the preliminary incident report filed by officer. She understood the extraordinary nature of what had occurred, but understanding and accepting were two different processes. "David, I'm going to ask you something that might seem strange," said carefully. "When you talk about Shadow, about the police dog, did you really hear him talking to you? Or is that how you understood what Shadow was doing?" David considered the question with a thoughtfulness that seemed impossibly mature for his age. "Shadow was in my head," he finally said. "Not like talking with words, but like knowing. Like when mommy knows I'm sad even if I don't say anything. Shadow knew I needed help. He knew where mommy was. He showed me the way." Nodded slowly, accepting David's explanation even though it transcended conventional understanding. "You're very brave, David. You did exactly what you needed to do. Your mommy is going to be okay because you were so smart and so brave." At 1:43 p.m., Doctor emerged from the operating room, his surgical mask pulled down around his neck, exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. He found Officer sitting in the waiting room, not related to Doctor, but the shared surname had become a kind of psychological comfort amid the stress of the case. "She's stabilized," Doctor announced without preamble. "We evacuated the hematoma, controlled the bleeding, and reduced the pressure on her brain tissue. The surgery went as well as we could hope for, given the severity of her injuries." "Will she be okay?" asked urgently. "Cognitively, I mean, will she have permanent damage?" Doctor removed his surgical cap and ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "That's the question we can't answer until she wakes up. The damage to brain tissue is sometimes apparent immediately, Sometimes it takes days or weeks to fully manifest. What I can tell you is that we did everything we could to prevent further deterioration. The fact that she received emergency medical care when she did was crucial. Another 6 to 8 hours without intervention would almost certainly have resulted in death or permanent vegetative state. Felt something release in his chest, not quite relief, but a reduction of the most acute terror. Jennifer was alive. She would remain alive. Whether she would wake up, whether she would be herself, remained to be determined. At 4:15 p.m., Jennifer was wheeled into the intensive care unit. She was placed on a ventilator to assist her breathing, surrounded by monitoring equipment that tracked every physiological function. Her skull had been partially reconstructed, her brain tissue carefully preserved, her arterial bleeding controlled. Everything that modern medicine could accomplish had been accomplished. Now came the waiting, the agonizing period of recovery or potential deterioration, or the uncertain middle ground where patients hovered between two states of being. At 5:30 p.m., David was finally allowed to visit his mother in the ICU, accompanied by an officer. The child's small face peered over the hospital bed rail, his eyes taking in the complex array of medical equipment, the ventilator tube in his mother's mouth, the bandages covering her head. And then, with a clarity that seemed impossible for someone so young, David reached out and placed his small hand on his mother's. "You're okay now, Mommy," David whispered. "Shadow helped you. The policeman and the police lady helped you. I waited on the bench like Shadow said, and they came. They found you just in time." Watched the child, tears streaming down her own face. Stood silently at the threshold, understanding that he was witnessing something profound. A child's faith, a child's love, a child's inexplicable connection to forces beyond rational comprehension. The doctors estimated Jennifer's recovery would take weeks, possibly months. Whether she would regain full cognitive function remained uncertain. Whether she would remember the fall, the unconsciousness, the 18 hours of darkness remained to be discovered. But she was alive. She was in recovery, and she owed her life, entirely and completely, to a 3-year-old child, a German Shepherd police dog, and 2 officers who chose to follow the impossible into rescue. The days following Jennifer's rescue were consumed by a phenomenon that neither nor the Riverside Police Department had anticipated: intense public interest in the extraordinary nature of their discovery. The story had spread rapidly through social media platforms, local news outlets, and eventually regional and national media. The narrative was too compelling, too unusual, too fundamentally compelling to ignore. A 3-year-old child who communicated with a police dog, who possessed impossible knowledge, who somehow guided rescue workers to his critically injured mother at precisely the moment intervention became necessary. By day 3, his desk at the Riverside Police Department was buried under requests from researchers, journalists, animal behaviorists, and academic institutions requesting interviews, investigation access, and comprehensive documentation. Chief of Police Robert Martinez called into his office at 8:00 a.m. on Thursday morning. "We need to get ahead of this narrative," Martinez said, his 30-year veteran's pragmatism evident in every word. "The media is spinning wild stories. I'm seeing headlines like 'Boy communicates telepathically with police dog' and 'Child possesses psychic connection to K9. We need to provide some kind of rational framework, even if we don't fully understand what happened." "I'm not sure we can provide a rational framework for something inherently irrational, sir," replied carefully. "I was there, I witnessed it, and I still can't explain it." Martinez nodded slowly. "Then we bring in experts, animal behaviorists, child psychologists, people who can at least help us understand the parameters of what's possible within their disciplines. Maybe there's an explanation we're simply not seeing." By the following Monday, found himself hosting a consultation meeting in the police department's conference room. Present were Dr. Sarah, an animal behaviorist from the University of California who specialized in canine cognition; Dr. James, a child psychologist affiliated with Riverside Children's Hospital; Dr. Michael Torres, a neuroscientist who studied the neurological basis of animal-human bonding; and Dr. Elizabeth, a linguistics expert who researched animal communication across species. "Let me be clear about what I observed," began, walking through the events of that morning in precise detail. He described Shadow's unusual behavior in the park, David's inexplicable knowledge of the dog's name, Shadow's directional certainty, and David's continued communication with the dog as they searched for his mother. Doctor was the first to speak. "What you're describing violates several fundamental principles of canine behavior and training. Dogs don't respond to untrained handlers using their names unless they've been previously socialized to recognize those names. Police dogs, specifically, are trained to respond only to their handler's voice and specific commands. The behavior you're describing, this dog appearing to understand a child's request and leading a rescue operation, is extraordinarily inconsistent with established K9 training protocols." "But is it impossible?" pressed. "Is there any mechanism through which a dog could understand a child's emotional state or location information without explicit verbal commands?" Dr. Torres leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Dogs possess extraordinary senses, particularly olfactory capability that transcends human understanding. A dog can detect minute chemical changes in a person's emotional state. They can track scent trails that we would consider imperceptible. In theory, if this child's mother was experiencing extreme stress or medical crisis, a sensitive dog might detect some combination of biological markers that indicated danger or need. But understanding the location of an unconscious person, that requires something beyond sensory perception." Doctor, the child psychologist, had been taking extensive notes. What's equally fascinating is the child's behavior and knowledge. 3-year-olds don't typically possess the cognitive capacity to independently navigate residential neighborhoods or provide accurate location descriptions. They certainly don't maintain the kind of emotional equilibrium that David demonstrated. The child should have been hysterical, traumatized, displaying acute distress symptoms. Instead, he was calm, focused, and possessed of specific knowledge about his mother's condition that he couldn't possibly have acquired through normal means. "Could it be coincidence?" Doctor asked. "Could the child have simply made an educated guess about where his mother was? Could Shadow have simply happened to lead them in the right direction based on random scent tracking?" Shook his head firmly. "With respect to the experts in this room, I don't believe coincidence adequately explains the specificity of the events. The child knew the dog's name. The dog responded to a child's request with behavioral patterns inconsistent with his training. And they arrived at exactly the right location at exactly the moment Jennifer's survival was most critically dependent upon immediate intervention. The probability of this occurring through random chance is astronomically low." Doctor nodded. "I'd agree with that assessment. The probability of coincidental alignment at this level approaches statistical impossibility, but that doesn't mean we should abandon attempts at rational explanation. What we might be observing is an extraordinary manifestation of capabilities that exist within normal neurological parameters, but which are rarely, if ever, activated simultaneously." "Meaning?" prompted. "Meaning," Doctor continued, "that dogs possess the neurological substrate for perceiving and responding to information beyond their formal training. Young children possess heightened intuitive capabilities that typically diminish with age and socialization. We theorize that young children maintain stronger connections to nonverbal communication channels than older humans. In rare instances, under conditions of extreme emotional intensity, a mother in mortal crisis, a child desperate to save her, these capabilities might align in ways that produce the behavior you observed." Doctor added, It's similar to documented cases of identical twins who possess apparent telepathic connection, or mothers who report sensing their child's distress across vast distances. The mechanisms aren't fully understood, but they exist within the realm of documented human experience. We're possibly observing the animal kingdom's equivalent of these documented phenomena. So you're saying this was possible? Asked. That there's a scientific explanation within normal parameters. I'm saying, Dr. Torres replied carefully, that we don't understand the full spectrum of neurological and sensory capabilities possessed by either dogs or young children. We operate within a framework of established knowledge that is constantly being expanded and revised. What you witnessed falls outside our current framework, but that doesn't necessarily mean it falls outside the boundaries of what's actually possible in nature. Over the next hour, the discussion evolved into theoretical exploration of various possibilities: extraordinary sensory perception, inherited or instinctive knowing, synchronistic alignment of neural patterns, species-wide capabilities that remained largely unexplored by modern science. By the meeting's conclusion, the experts had arrived at a consensus position. What occurred in Riverside Park conventional explanation, but it wasn't necessarily supernatural. It was simply a manifestation of capabilities that science had yet to fully understand or categorize. Doctors submitted a formal report that concluded, the events described represent an extraordinary but not necessarily impossible intersection of canine sensory perception, child intuition, and circumstantial alignment. While the probability of these factors aligning simultaneously remains exceptionally low, the alignment itself operates within parameters of acknowledged neurological function. Further study of this case may contribute to expanded understanding of interspecies communication and child cognitive development. The report was published in academic journals, discussed at veterinary conferences, and cited in papers about animal cognition for years to come, but understood something that the academic discussion could not capture. The mystery remained intact. The explanations might make logical sense, but they didn't fully account for the profound nature of what had occurred. Shadow knew. Somehow, impossibly, completely beyond rational explanation, Shadow knew where Jennifer was. David knew. With a knowledge that transcended his age and experience, David understood where his mother lay and how to summon help. And those two forms of knowing aligned at exactly the moment they were needed most. Stood at the park one evening, throwing a tennis ball for Shadow to retrieve. The dog brought the ball back and pressed it into his hand, waiting for the next throw. In the dog's eyes, saw intelligence, connection, and something that transcended the boundaries of standard behavioral science. "You know something we don't," said quietly to his partner. "Don't you, buddy?" Shadow's tail wagged, and the dog released the ball, ready for the next throw. Some mysteries, thought, were meant to remain unsolved. Some truths existed beyond the reach of scientific explanation. And perhaps that was exactly as it should be, a reminder that the universe contained wonders that transcended human understanding, that connection existed between all creatures, and that love could manifest in ways that science had yet to comprehend. Jennifer regained consciousness on day 4 of her hospitalization. Her eyes flickered open at 3:47 a.m., the moment marked in her medical record with both clinical precision and profound relief. The ventilator tube in her throat prevented her from speaking, but her eyes moved, tracking objects in her hospital room, focusing on the monitors displaying her vital signs. Consciousness was the first victory in what would become a months-long battle toward recovery. Doctor entered her room at 6:00 a.m. during rounds, conducting the neurological assessment that would determine whether her cognitive function had survived the trauma. He held up 2 fingers. "Jennifer, can you see these?" Her eyes focused on his hand. "Blink twice if you understand me." She blinked twice. "Good, you're going to be okay. You're in the hospital, you had a fall. You've been unconscious for 4 days. We're going to help you heal." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, an emotional response that indicated her consciousness extended beyond simple reflex. She was in there, the essential Jennifer, intact despite the trauma her brain had endured. The medical team began the careful process of weaning her from the ventilator, removing the tube that had sustained her breathing, slowly transitioning toward independent respiratory function. By day 6, Jennifer could speak in whispered, hoarse tones. The first question she asked was about David. "My son, where is my son? Is he safe?" Officer visited her that afternoon, his police uniform crisp and formal despite the weight of emotional connection he carried toward this case. "Your son is safe," assured her. "He's in protective custody with a social worker, but he's safe and healthy. He's actually been quite extraordinary throughout this entire ordeal." "I don't understand," Jennifer whispered, her voice still weak from disuse. "How did he survive? He was just a baby. He was alone in the house. How did anyone find me? How did you know where I was?" Pulled a chair close to Jennifer's bedside and began the explanation. The discovery of David in the park, the child's inexplicable knowledge, the communication with the police dog, the impossible journey that led them to the basement stairs. Jennifer listened with the expression of someone attempting to process information that logical comprehension. "My son," she finally whispered, "communicated with a dog, and the dog knew where I was." "That's one way of describing what happened," acknowledged. "Your son was very brave. He survived alone for approximately 18 hours, and then he guided us to you at precisely the moment your medical condition made intervention critical." Tears streamed down Jennifer's face. "I need to see him. I need to hold my baby." By day 8, Jennifer had progressed enough to be moved to a standard hospital room. Park brought David to visit his mother, the social worker maintaining careful observation to ensure the reunion remained emotionally healthy rather than traumatizing. David walked into the room with the same quiet confidence he demonstrated throughout the entire ordeal. He approached his mother's bedside slowly, understanding with some inexplicable wisdom that she was fragile, that her body required careful treatment. "Mommy," David said softly, placing his small hand on his mother's uninjured arm. "You're awake now. Shadow said you would wake up. Shadow said the helpers were taking good care of you. Are you okay?" Jennifer reached out with her uninjured arm and pulled her son against her chest, her body shaking with sobs of relief, gratitude, and the profound realization of how close she'd come to never seeing him again. "Yes, baby, I'm okay, because of you, because you were so brave." "Shadow was brave," David corrected gently. "And the policeman and the police lady, they all helped Mommy. I knew they would. Shadow told me." The reunion lasted 2 hours, carefully monitoring the emotional intensity while allowing mother and son to reconnect. When it was time for David to leave, he placed his hand on his mother's face with surprising gentleness. "You're going to be okay now, Mommy. Shadow said so." 3 months later, on a crisp January morning, Riverside held a formal ceremony honoring K9 Shadow for his role in the rescue. The event was held in the park where David had been discovered, transformed into a community gathering space with hundreds of residents in attendance. Mayor Harrison stood at a podium, her formal remarks echoing across the assembled crowd. "Today we honor Shadow, a police dog whose actions transcended the parameters of his training, whose instincts guided us toward a miracle, whose partnership with his handler officer exemplifies the best of our law enforcement community." Shadow received a Medal of Valor, an honor rarely bestowed upon animals, which was carefully fastened to a special collar designed for ceremonial occasions. The German Shepherd stood patiently as photographers captured the moment, his amber eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed to acknowledge the gathering's significance. David, now 4 years old and recovered from his ordeal with the psychological resilience that sometimes characterizes very young children, approached Shadow as the ceremony concluded. The child placed both small hands on the dog's face, and the two shared a moment of quiet connection that silenced the crowd. No words were exchanged, But something passed between them, a recognition, an acknowledgement, a continuation of the bond that had manifested so extraordinarily in October. "He says thank you," David announced to the gathered assembly. "Shadow says thank you for making him a helper. He says helping people is the best thing. He says everybody should help each other when they need it." Stood beside his partner, his hand resting gently on Shadow's neck, watching the boy and dog together. In that moment, he understood something fundamental about the events that had transpired. This wasn't simply a story about extraordinary rescue. This was a story about connection, the deep, inexplicable connection between all living beings when love and need transcend the boundaries of species and logic. Jennifer made a full recovery over the following months. She regained her cognitive function completely, suffered no permanent neurological damage, and returned to her work as a graphic designer by May. The physical recovery was more challenging. The broken bones healed, but physical therapy proved exhausting and painful. But Jennifer persevered, driven by gratitude for her survival and wonder at the inexplicable circumstances of her rescue. David grew up with an unshakable conviction that animals possessed wisdom beyond human understanding. At age 7, he began volunteering at the Riverside Animal Shelter. By age 16, he was demonstrating an extraordinary aptitude for understanding animal behavior and supporting distressed animals. At age 18, he received his college acceptance to study veterinary science at UC Davis, a university renowned for its animal research programs. In his college application essay, David wrote, "I have always believed that animals possess knowledge and awareness that humans have yet to fully comprehend. When I was 3 years old, a police dog named Shadow guided my rescue when my mother suffered a critical injury. That experience convinced me that my life's work must be dedicated to understanding animals, protecting them, and helping humans appreciate the extraordinary capabilities they possess. I want to spend my life bridging the gap between human and animal consciousness, honoring the wisdom that animals offer if we are willing to listen." Officer remained Shadow's handler for the remainder of the dog's career. When Shadow retired at age 10, adopted him, providing his partner with a comfortable life surrounded by the love and respect the dog had earned. Often visited the Riverside Park, walking the trails where everything had begun, reflecting on the mystery that had transformed his understanding of what was possible in the universe. 35 years later, when retired from the police force, he received a commendation that read, "In recognition of extraordinary service, exceptional judgment, and the courage to follow intuition beyond the boundaries of rational protocol," but understood that the real honor belonged not to him, but to a 3-year-old child and a German shepherd who had somehow aligned their consciousness in a way that transcended explanation. The story of the boy who spoke to a police dog became part of Riverside's local legend, passed down through generations, told and retold with variations that gradually approached myth. But those who lived through the extraordinary events, Sarah Williams, Park, Jennifer, and David himself, carried the truth in their hearts. They understood that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, that some connections transcended rational understanding, and that sometimes the universe aligned in ways that reminded humans of the fundamental mystery of existence. Shadow lived to age 13, surrounded by love and the deep respect of a community that understood his role in an inexplicable rescue. When he passed, his obituary appeared in the Riverside newspaper, honoring not just his professional service, but the extraordinary moment when he transcended his training to save a life. And in that transcendence, Shadow had given everyone involved a gift far more valuable than any medal or commendation. The gift of wonder, the confirmation that mysteries existed in the world, and the assurance that love and connection could manifest in ways that science had yet to explain.